he stumbled backwards into my lap, and he goes, he blocked, and he turned around, and he gave me a big kiss. He gave me a big kiss right on the lips.
This episode of Beat Everyone is brought to you by Broadway Joe's Fantasy Sports. Inspired by football legend Joe Namath, embrace the thrill of daily fantasy sports like never before in an app coming this fall. Welcome back to Beat Everyone. I am Ben Flanigan. I'm with AL.com's Michael Casagrande. It's time for another edition of the Golden Age, and we're sitting here with the great Eli Gold, the beloved voice of the Crimson Tide. And Eli, today is all about superlatives. We're going to talk about the best games you've ever called, stories of some of the moments maybe you wish you could have had back if those even exist. Is that okay?
Sure, whatever you guys want to talk about. Let's get going.
So let it rip. So we talk about the catalog of great moments, great calls you've made. I guess what goes into, for you, what makes a call a great call?
Well, that's a good question. I guess you just know it when you hear it. You were right on the money. You had everything called correctly. You didn't mess up a name. You had everything down to the nth degree. That basically is what would make a great call. Of course, if Alabama was on the receiving end of doing the good stuff, well, that made it a little bit better and the energy was a little bit higher. If it was the other team making the big play, you had to acknowledge it, certainly, but the excitement level may not have been quite what it was had it been Bama on offense or defense making the big play.
What do you consider the best game you ever called?
Oh, God, I don't know. When you say best game, you're talking about the actual game itself?
Yeah,
I mean,
I
like the
this.
game against Georgia, the overtime national championship game, and I think we mentioned this on a previous episode, the game stunk, but the finish, well, that was great. But the other, rest of the day was like, oh my goodness, what the heck's going on here? There were a lot of games like that. The 1989 game at Penn State with the Thomas Rayam block of Ray Tarasy's field goal attempt. Penn State was marching up the field. It was not a great game for Alabama per se, but the finish was spectacular when that double thud, the kick, and then the swatting of the ball out of midair by Thomas Rayam, that made it a spectacular day. But the game wasn't at times that great. So it's a tough one to answer, really. There have been so many. I mean, and some of those games that, you'd think were great are a little more challenging to broadcast. The national championship win over Notre Dame in Miami years ago, it was tough because Phil Savage and I were telling stories, and again, I mentioned this on a previous episode. We were telling stories in the first quarter. The game was that far out of hand, so now you're looking at 3/4 of a football game to go, and the outcome is no longer in doubt. So you're trying to work and tell interesting stories and look for that little minutia that'll keep the audience engaged so they don't, change the channel and go listen or watch something else. So there's a lot that goes into answering that question.
You guys could have taken phone calls in the second half of that championship game with Notre Dame.
We could have. The day before, or was it 2 days prior, at the media gathering there at the stadium, Alabama walked in, and then Notre Dame walked in. And, Alabama, they were men. They were men. And Notre Dame walked in, and they looked like, a bunch of seniors in high school. And I was shocked. I really was. And, Phil looked at me, Phil Savage, my color man. We were standing together on the sideline, and he looked at me and goes, well, this one's over. That was the extent of his comment. So, but it sometimes is tough when you have, when you're up 56-0, and it's good because your team is up 56-0. but you're really having to work hard to keep it extra interesting so the listener doesn't go out to the backyard and cut the lawn or go out onto the boat or just turn the radio off altogether.
Yeah, no, if you had to think about it, though, what's maybe the best game you've called?
Again, that's
your performance.
My performance? Gosh, I don't know. That's for other people to say, Michael. I don't know. I know some of the tougher ones that I've done, some that were not as good, were probably because I was ill. I remember doing a game, and the first two that come to mind were both in Baton Rouge. It was the year between Kenny Stabler having left and Phil Savage having come in. And that one year, if you might remember, I had like 14 different color men. Every week, I had somebody new that we were auditioning, basically, on the air. And in Baton Rouge, Bob Baumhauer was my analyst. And Bob was good, but I was sick as a dog. I had no voice. I woke up, I don't know what it was, and I sounded like a Christmas goose. I mean, it was awful. It really was awful. And I honked my way through that broadcast, and my voice would come and go, and I was coughing and coughing. And when I wasn't coughing, I was coughing. You know, it was one of those deals. It was a tough, tough day, and I'm sure, and I did not go back to listen to it. I just didn't want to subject myself to that. But I'm sure I was not sharp or anything along those lines. And then a few years ago, I caught COVID, and it started getting to me right in the middle of the ball game in Baton Rouge. And we had and still do, you have an in-booth camera sponsored by Royal Furniture, and fans, for whatever reason, and I guess it's because they just like to see how we work, we had this camera in the booth, and it was pointed at me and my color man and Butch Owens, my spotter, and whoever was sitting over here to my right or to my left. I guess it might have been Roger Hoover, whatever it was. But and I've watched that tape, and as the game went on, you could see me getting redder and sweatier, and then I would undo a button. Then I was wearing a little jacket, and that evening was a little chilly, but then I took the jacket off. I mean, I was sick. I was big time sick. I got through the game, went back to the hotel. I had driven to Baton Rouge. Actually, I rode with Tom Stipe. I took my car to Tuscaloosa from Birmingham, and then I met Tom, and we drove on together. And I got into the car at the hotel Sunday morning. I sat down, put my head up, I put my head back, and then I woke up as we pulled into Tom's driveway. I mean, I was sick. And I'm sure I was not terribly, I'm sure I was somewhat accurate, but I'm sure I made more mistakes that day than normal. And, you know, I'm human. You know, people say, hey, why did Eli say the ball's on the 17? It's on the 16. Well, pardon the heck out of me. You know, it happens. So, you know, I've made my share, and I've had the wrong guy scoring a touchdown. You feel terrible, but you misidentify somebody. That has happened. So the folks watching and listening, they can tell you far better than I which were my better and which were my worst broadcasts. But, you know, I always tried to do the very best I could.
Eli, on that note, you've heard commentators like Charles Barkley, for instance. He has told stories about superstars like Kobe Bryant calling him where he didn't like something he said about him, and Charles Barkley says, well, you never called me about the hundreds of good things I said about you. But I do wonder, this seems unlikely to me, but did you ever hear from any coaches or players or any Alabama brass about a call that they didn't like after the fact?
No. I have heard from a parent or two And it was about nothing negative per se, but, our son likes to be called Charles as opposed to Charlie. I said, well, he sees me at practice 3 times a week. He's never mentioned it, but I apologize. I didn't know. And I then began calling him Charles, stuff like that. Another very interesting one was the basketball player Latrell Sprewell. I'm sure you remember Spree. Went on to play for the Milwaukee Bucks after he played for Wimp here at Alabama. And Wimp always called him Latrell Sprewell. He always called him Sprewell. Why? I don't know. He just called him Sprewell. My mistake was not checking with Latrell to double-check the pronunciation. But I said to myself, well, if the head coach calls him Sprewell and the guy who recruited him calls him Sprewell, his name is Sprewell. Well, it was starting Latrell's second year, maybe his third year. And he came up to me one day at practice and said, Mr. Eli? I said, yeah, Latrell, what's up? He goes, I got a question for you. He said, is it possible for you to call me by my correct last name? I said, what is your correct last name? He said, we pronounce it Sprewell. I said, why have you waited this long to tell me that? He said, well, I just didn't want to correct you. I felt funny. I said, don't be silly, man. That's your name. And then I had it happen again a few years ago with Patrick Surtain. Now, I'd known of his dad for years, collegiately and in the National Football League. And he was always Patrick Surtain. He was always Patrick Surtain. Then people were referring to the Alabama player as Surtain. So I said, well, I got to get to the bottom of this. I said, what am I, somebody's wrong. Somebody's wrong. So I walked up to him and one day at practice, and I said, hey, I said, Patrick, I said, I've respected your dad and I've loved watching him and great ball player and this, but, he was always called Patrick Surtain. And you're referring to yourself as Patrick Surtain. He said, yeah, I said, people were never right when they called my daddy Surtain, but he never corrected anybody. He said, but the family, we call ourselves Surtain. So I quickly changed from Surtain to Surtain. And again, I felt I didn't have to check because I'd heard about his daddy being talked about forever, and turned out I should have checked. So I've learned that. I've learned that over the years. But one time I wish I hadn't checked. This is an interesting one. Bama's playing. Remember that there was an era in basketball when the preseason games, you always played a team from Marathon Oil. Remember them? And you always played a team, Athletes in Action.
Yep.
Athletes in Action. They would come out at halftime and offer their religious testimony and so on and so forth. Well, there was a year or two there where all the conferences, the SEC, the ACC, Big Ten, Big 12, they all got together and they brought these foreign teams over to play the preseason. So instead of playing Marathon Oil and Athletes in Action, Bama played, Belarusia and, Uzbekistan, whoever the two teams were. And I remember the one night, here the game, the doors to Coleman Coliseum open up around 5 o'clock, and in walk a dozen tall Belarusians, led by this guy who was about as tall as he was around. He was a big, bushy mustache, wearing what was once a white shirt, had a little thin black tie, and it turned out he was the liaison to the Belarusian Sports Federation. That was how he was introduced to us. I kind of thought he was probably from the KGB or something, but I didn't know. That didn't bother me. But he was like their traveling secretary, okay? And he handled everything, including sitting down with me, and Tom Roberts was doing my color at the time, and he sat down with Tony Giles, the public address announcer at Coleman Coliseum, and he went over the pronunciations of his roster. Not that our broadcast nor Tony's announcements were going to be heard in Belarusia, but these guys deserve to have their names pronounced correctly. So he would go down the roster, and I would write the names down phonetically. That was the way I do it. Well, he accidentally skipped little number 5. Just missed him and went down to the bottom, and I said, "Excuse me," and at this point I realized I didn't know the gentleman's name. So I said, "Excuse me, comrade." I figured that wouldn't start the missiles flying. It's a true story. I said, "Excuse me, comrade, you skipped little number 5. You're starting guard, I guess. How does he pronounce his name?" And he says to me, with the least little hint of a smirk, creasing the corners of his lips, he said, "I am sorry to say," in his heavy accent, he said, "I am sorry to say his name pronounced exactly the way it look." So I looked down at the sheet, and I looked back up at him, and I said, "No, don't tell me that." He said, "Yes, his name pronounced exactly the way it look." Well, his first name was Lubomir, which is nothing we hear around Alabama regularly, but it's not that difficult of a name. But his last name was spelled Yourin. Yourin. Well, I'm a child at heart. Tom Roberts was a child. The game begins. Ball's tipped in the air. It goes to little number 5. And he starts bouncing the ball up the floor, and off you go. You're playing basketball. And I'm doing the play-by-play, and I said, "And here comes Urine dribbling up the court." And Tom Roberts started laughing like a child. And he would, before he'd laugh out loud, he'd kind of percolate. He'd go like that, and then they start moving the ball. You've seen the international game. They move the ball around, and they pass up on a good shot, waiting for that great shot, and the ball goes into the far corner. And there's little number 5, puts it up, long range, nothing but net. 3-0 Belarusia. And I say on the air, I said, "Well, I believe urine is hot tonight." Well, Tom started laughing again. Well, when Tom started laughing again, I started laughing again. And we laughed our way through that entire broadcast. So things can go wrong sometimes, but, But
sometimes you're given a gift.
Sometimes you're given a gift. But no, it's just, there have been tough games. I remember doing a hockey game at Madison Square Garden numbers of years ago. It was the St. Louis Blues, for whom I was doing their television, against the New York Rangers. And I was excited. It was my home arena, if you will. I was a season ticket holder there, sold peanuts there as a kid. And here I am back doing a broadcast. And in the course of my play-by-play, the Rangers had a guy who was a great former U.S. Olympian by the name of Robbie Ftorek. Maybe you've heard the name, maybe you haven't.
Who hasn't?
Yeah, he was a great hockey player. Well, Robbie Ftorek, and of course the little rubber round black thing that you play hockey with is the puck. And I was trying to say, and here's Ftorek with the puck, but I accidentally transposed the first 2 letters of those words. And instead of saying, "Here's Ftorek with the puck," I said, "Here's Ftorek with the..."
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing I had been taught is never to stop in a situation like that and point out your mistake to anybody. Because chances are people aren't listening as closely as they need to. You could just visualize it somewhere, the lady of the house saying, "Harry, did I just hear him say that?" And he says, "Pearl, are you kidding me? Be quiet, And so I just kept going. But everybody in the booth knew what I said, and our engineer looked at me, and my color man looked at me, and I just had a big old smile on my face, but I just kept on going and didn't bring attention to it and never heard a word about it.
No, Harry and Pearl did not notice.
Harry and Pearl did not notice, or at least they didn't write to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and turn me in.
Well, we need to take a break before we get fined by the FCC. We're going to come back
and we're going to talk about some of Eli's greatest all-time calls, some of the greatest games ever. And we're going to hear from a fan, too. So We'll be right back on Beat Everyone. This is the Golden Age. Keep listening. We're back here on Beat Everyone. This is the Golden Age. Ben Flanigan here with Michael Casagrande, and we're sitting here with Eli Gold. And Eli, it's time to relive some of those great memories, obviously.
Of which there have been many.
Yeah, many great memories. Yes. And I guess I want to start 1989. That was your first football season.
My first football season, right.
And you mentioned the Penn State field goal block.
Yeah.
And do you consider that, I mean, looking back, I'm sure there were plenty during that season, but do you consider that sort of like your first big call? And what do you remember about that moment specifically? And how did you get it right?
How did I get it right? I don't know. But that was the first big call that had any notoriety to it, because it was Alabama, Penn State. It was at Beaver Stadium. It was just a big national game. And what we did in those days, my color man was Doug Layton. Our sideline reporter was Jerry Duncan. And as a sideline reporter, Jerry was a good offensive lineman, but he was not a great sideline reporter. He would get so worked up and so excited. You know, sometimes you'd toss it down to him. I'd say, Jerry, what'd you see? He goes, Eli, I didn't see much of anything. So my eyes were closed. I was praying too hard. You know, that was Jerry. And, well, anyway, we had decided before that Penn State game that with 5 minutes to go in regulation, Jerry would come up from the sidelines, because his other job was going into the locker room after the game and doing the post-game interviews live on the radio. And Jerry was not a great interviewer. It was not what he was meant to do. So we did, with 5 minutes to go in the game, we'd bring Jerry up from the sidelines, and he'd sit next to me. And Doug Layton, who was sitting here, my color man, he would get up and go down to the sidelines. And then as soon as the game was over, Dougie Doo, as we used to call him, Dougie Doo would go into the locker room and do the postgame. Well, here now, the final possession for Penn State. And they just marched the ball down the field, down every handoff. Further down the field they went. Bama couldn't stop him. He finally takes a knee on the half-yard line with like 12 or 13 or 14 seconds to go, trying to score what would be the winning touchdown. Bama was up by a couple of points, whatever it might have been. Well, Joe Paterno calls timeout, and we take a commercial break. And then in the booth, I remember it was totally silent, because Ray Tarasi, their kicker from Pittsburgh, was going to have a chip shot field goal. I mean, they were snapping the ball. The nose of the ball was on the goal line. So, you know, you snap it back to the 7 off the near hash mark is what they had picked. It was going to be an easy kick. And everybody was kind of down in the mouth that we had flown all the way up there and played the game, and you're going to go home with a 1-point loss in your pocket or whatever it was. Well, so Jerry's sitting here, and me, and Butch is standing behind me, and I forget who was to my left, probably Tom Roberts. And the ball is snapped. There's that kick, the thud of Tarasi's foot hitting the ball, and then the unmistakable second thud, which was Thomas Rayam's arm hitting the ball out of midair. And I made the call, and I said, "It's blocked," instantly not knowing who did it. But then I don't know why. I guess God was looking after me. The body's kind of parted a little bit, and I followed that arm right down to Thomas Rayam's number. And I said, Thomas Rayam. But Jerry, God bless him, a former player and just a great Bama fan, Jerry is standing to my right for this kick. He stood up. I'm sitting down. And Jerry stood up, and he's jumping up and down. And he goes, he blocked it, Eli. He blocked it. Well, Doug Layton used to like to tape his microphone cable to the table. It kind of stayed out of the way that way. It didn't get on his papers. He just kind of taped it down. Well, Jerry, this was the first time he was up in the booth, and Jerry's got the headset on, and he leans back in his jubilation and runs out of cable because it was taped down. And he stumbled, and he fell backwards into my lap. And we're live on the radio. I mean, you can't make this up, folks. I'm telling you.
Usually had a booth cam for that one.
Yeah, you really do. He stumbled backwards into my lap, and he goes, he blocked it. And he turned around, and he gave me a big kiss. He gave me a big kiss right on the lips. And, folks, you haven't lived until you've been kissed by Jerry Duncan, I promise you. But Bama wins the ball game, and that was quite the finish. So I'll always remember that one, not only for the actual play, but because of Jerry falling into my lap and giving me a kiss.
Quite the romantic comedy.
Oh, it really was. I mean, it was unbelievable. And you can't make that up. No. I mean, that happened as the day was long.
Broadcasting history.
Wow.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, so first national championship at Alabama, 1992, played in 1993, obviously. There were some amazing plays in that game. Obviously, the Teague play that got called back, but his interception, obviously, too. You had a great call on that. What do you remember about that game? Is there a moment that stands out to you, it being your first championship?
Well, the moment that stood out to me was bringing everybody on the defense up to the line of scrimmage. That happened right off the bat. And that, and I remember Gino Torretta calling a timeout like in the first minute of the ball game. And that was good. But yeah, the best play in Alabama history that never happened. That was a great one. The steal of the ball going down the left sideline, and of course, just winning the national championship. That was, for me, selfishly. I mean, it was great. I was a Bama fan and so on, but it was, I thought, something that would further help me cement myself with the Alabama faithful. I brought them this great piece of news that the Tide has won the national championship. It was my third year, I guess, of doing football. So that was magnificent. It really was. But one of the funniest things happened years later. I'm doing NFL games for the Sports USA radio network, and I don't know if it was, I think it was my second game ever for them. And who was my color man?
Gino Torretta.
Gino Torretta. And we met at a restaurant for dinner, and we talked, and he knew who I was, of course. And he said, all right, get it out of your system. I said, what? And I had a big smile on my, he goes, get it out of your system. I said, Gino, I'm not going to rub it in. I mean, you're a Heisman Trophy winner, for crying out loud. What right do I have it to rub it in to you? But yeah, that was something. He said, all right. I said, but I do have one question to ask you. I said, you spent so much time on your back. How many tiles are there on the inside of the roof of the Superdome? And he goes, thanks a lot. But
he's a good guy. I worked with Gino before. He's a very good dude.
Yes, Gino and I have become good friends.
Being the first championship game, I'm sure that was big.
Yeah.
Exciting for you. 2009 is the next game we wanted to mention. That was my first year covering the team when I was working for the Decatur Daily, and I remember being so nervous going into writing about that game because this is a moment that people are going to be cutting out newspaper clippings.
Sure.
I'm sure, I don't know if it was the same way for you in 92, that people are going to remember that call.
I don't know if it was any one call
right,
per se, but, I was very cognizant of how big the broadcast was, sure, obviously. But I don't know if there was one call that sticks out in my mind from that game.
If no call, the fact that it's the first championship in 17 years.
Yeah.
I mean, and you obviously, we talked about on another episode, the call at the end of the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what did that mean, you think? Like, I mean, it was obviously the dawn of the Saban dynasty at Alabama. Was that a moment where you thought, wow, it's about to get real here in terms of championships again?
That was one. Probably one that came even more impactful to me was the game at Georgia. The blackout game, remember, where they all wore black jerseys and the fans wore the black polo shirts and T-shirts and all of that, and Alabama won in Athens. And I remember, and I still wasn't sure how good going in. I didn't know. I knew the team was good, but I didn't quite know how good they were. So that road game at Athens was going to be a good litmus test. And I remember after the win, I remember walking back to the car in the press parking lot, and I was saying to my wife, I said, I believe this can be a pretty darn good year. I believe we got ourselves a ball club here. It was just amazing the way Nick Saban was able to get more out of the players than they themselves knew they had to give. That was one of the keys to his success.
What about just the Rose Bowl? Being an old school guy, there's something romantic about that place.
It was very, very special against Texas. It was, a big game, obviously, the national title game. Colt McCoy, their starting quarterback, was
for a little bit.
For a little, but he did start, and he was very, very good, obviously. So you never take anything for granted. It was just, as the day went on, of course, Colt got hurt, and so on and so forth, and then Marcel Darius did that pickup of the Utah shovel pass, did a full pirouette, which for a big man was impressive enough to watch, and then he took it in just before the half, and that pretty much was the nail in the coffin, as I felt. And then, of course, the game wound up with another Bama title, and the call that we had talked about a few weeks ago about and the roses in this grand old stadium are once again crimson. So that was a very, very special night. And the fact that you're sitting there and you look into your left and there's the San Gabriel Mountains and the whole thing, the whole setting was just very magical. It really was.
Eli, I want to ask you about another national championship season, but we have a voicemail first from a fan who asked you about this game in particular. It's the LSU game in 2012.
Hey, Eli, this is Rayam from Virginia, lifelong fan of yours, and I had a question about a specific call that you made in 2012 when Alabama beat LSU. It's unique because the call is sort of interrupted by your cohort, Phil Savage. Less than a minute left in the fourth quarter. Alabama's down 17-14. TJ Yeldon starts to run towards the end zone. You start one of your classic calls saying 25, 15, 10. But then Phil Savage says, you made a man miss right during your call. And then you continue. As you're making the call, Phil Savage says, yes!
I
right
remember
in the
that.
middle. And to me, it's just one of the most memorable calls ever because clearly Phil is so excited. I was wondering what you thought of that call. What is the dynamic sort of like with you and your partner in the booth? When is it okay and not okay for your color commentary person to interject as you're calling the play-by-play? I'm not mad at it because I watch that call all the time. And it's one of my favorite ever, one of my favorite Alabama football moments in recent history. Thank you so much. Huge fan for life. Wish you all the best, and Roll Tide.
Thank you. Roll Tide. Ideally, you should never be interrupted, okay? Ideally, you should never be interrupted. And as an interesting sidelight to that, in every other game from that point forward until Phil left us after about 10 years, when something like that was going to happen or looked like it was going to happen, Tom Stipe would take his microphone and pull it down, seriously, because it could have blown, a major call. But in that instance, he just went, and I heard him, and I stopped. And my training on that was when I did NASCAR for 41 years. if you're talking during a NASCAR broadcast and somebody else interrupts you, it's understood that what they have to say is more important than what you are saying. And it's incumbent upon you to shut up, and it's incumbent upon him to just keep going. If I'm at the start-finish line and the guy said, trouble in turn 2, I got to shut up because he's going to go, Joe blows in the wall and he's done this and he's done that and whatever it might be. So that was where my training came in. When I heard Phil interrupt me, I immediately clammed up. Then I resumed again. Then he said something else and I stopped. And then I resumed again. It was honest emotion, and it made for great radio. But by design, you don't like that. By design, you don't want to be, it's like, like one of these guys here in the middle of their column, somebody else comes over, grabs the keyboard, writes a sentence, and goes on.
Make it better.
Well, that's up for debate. And the same thing for our listeners. It's up for them to debate whether it was a good call or not. It was not a bad call by any stretch. He did not ruin it. But it was a little bit unnerving. But listening to it afterwards, I'm just like that gentleman. It was a great call, and I remember that, man. I can vividly see it in my head as he was recounting it.
The color guys can't help themselves sometimes. They get so absorbed in the moment.
Couldn't.
No, right. Jerry couldn't.
Well, we mentioned the 89 Penn State call where you said the color guy said block, 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 right? I mean, you have that covered, right? You can say he blocked it.
Yeah.
I think in the Georgia game, the Tua to Devontae, I think before he even catches the ball, the color guy says touchdown.
Touchdown. Yeah.
Eli's going to say touchdown.
Yeah, that was Phil again.
Oh, Phil.
Yeah.
Repeat offender.
Yeah, it's a repeat offender.
Right.
But we never heard from Phil again.
No, never heard from Phil again. But it was a nice relationship when it lasted. But no, it's that happens, and I'd rather be working with somebody who cares than somebody who's just there because it was assigned to them. So, but yes, by design. If you look at the book, there is no book. But if you look at the book, color man never interrupts the play-by-play guy during the calling of a play. But when it happens, you hope for the best. And clearly it was those calls were just fine.
I want to go back just a couple of years because one of your most famous calls is the Tennessee Terrence Cody block.
Yeah.
That was huge. And, we talked about Penn State. This, obviously, you're great at the block call, right? Like, you get excited, too.
Sure.
That just seems like one of the most exhilarating things you couldn't call on live radio, TV, whatever. What do you remember about that moment?
Well, that moment, I saw the block, and I knew it was blocked. I knew that. I wasn't sure who had blocked it at the moment. So I talked around it. And then I saw Terrence off to the side, and if I'm not mistaken, he pulled his helmet off first, and I said, Terrence Cody, I just took a chance that the reason he was celebrating so much, even more so than the normal celebration, was because he had blocked it, and indeed that was the case. But you just look and you make sure what you saw. You make sure. I don't even know if I double clutched. But I sure as heck, and I had my binoculars out, so I was, looking. But you want to make sure you got it right. But there was no question it was blocked, and Alabama won. And as it turns out, that probably saved the national title.
Absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's a wrap on that one, Eli. Thank you so much.
Right.
Let's do it again soon.
Definitely. Maybe next week.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And if y'all out there have a question for Eli, leave us a voicemail at 205-523-4809. Subscribe to Beat Everyone on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Catch us on YouTube as well. And for Michael Casagrande and Eli Gold, I'm Ben Flanigan. Thank you so much. This episode of Beat Everyone is brought to you by Broadway Joe's Fantasy Sports. Inspired by football legend Joe Namath, embrace the thrill of daily fantasy sports like never before in an app coming this fall.